Hi, I'm Sally Treanor. Welcome to Lesson 2, Small Format Landscapes, Wet on Dry. In this lesson, we're going to again be using Cobalt Blue, Winsor Yellow, Permanent Rose, plus French Ultramarine Blue to get nice darks. The lesson is going to be about using dry paper to start and laying colors next to one another that are still wet so we get beautiful bleeds, giving us suggested landscape items. So let's paint.
I'd like to start with a little paper preparation, and I've got two of them here. They're a lot of fun, and I'm going to introduce some brushes we haven't used before. I've got two here that are terrific brushes. One of them is a 1.5-inch brush, and the other one is a 2-inch brush. The one that is the 2-inch is the Cheap Joe's, again, this is the Golden Fleece, and it's the flat-handled gold wash. It's the one that I recommend as a reasonably priced brush. The other one is a Nobel and China made. It's the 1.5-inch brush. At any rate, let me just show you quickly how I prepared the paper. So I'm dipping into my clean water and I'm just spreading water on my sheet of paper. Okay, now I wet all this stuff before, so I'm going to come back and take my cobalt blue, make a nice puddle out of it. And I'm going to come into my wet sky. This is wet only on one side of the paper. And let my brush kind of play across the surface and let the color run through that water. This is standing water. It's different. So the standing water, there's more water available. Pigment will move as far as it can go if it's got someplace wet to go. And remember I said before, make a puddle of permanent rose that is not much value. Well, that's what this is. This is pretty dilute. There's not a lot of pigment in there. Again, I'm going to let my brush kind of gently play over the surface. Some of that is turning into violet. Some of that is remaining red. And so now I've got a piece of paper that's prepped to take any kind of something happening to it. I'm going to use Thirsty brush. You wet the brush and it's clean water, and you use it to just grab some of that paint that's extra at the bottom. And by wicking up, I mean taking out excess water, sometimes pigment as well. I could come in even now, again, very dilute puddle of yellow, and let's just see what it'll do. I like coming in at the bottom and letting it flow into that wet area at the top and see what happens. And what happens actually is some of that yellow is producing some orange, some of it's remaining yellow. The part that's remaining yellow instead of turning orange is moving the red out of the way because the yellow is wetter. That's the simplest thing we're going to do today. Let's come into this guy. Now, working on dry paper is lots easier than working on wet paper. So let's go ahead and do some things. Now, I've got 3 discrete puddles of color, but let's start combining. As soon as I put the 3 colors, the pigments of the triad together, it lowers the intensity. So this is a dry piece of paper with a prepared sky, and I'm going to just put in some hills in the background. They're covering the bottom of that sky, and it's red. I'm putting some red into this area that I have painted on there. Now let's rinse the brush. We're not at the point where we're being so careful about water yet. We're just changing the terrain as it's going to come closer and closer. Now I'm making my green puddle a little stronger, leaving some white areas that I can decide about later. So I've got something going on here that is obviously a landscape. Let's come into it with some drop-in color and see what we can do to change its characteristics. So now I'm using, this is not a rigger, but it's a rigger type brush. It's a little shorter hairs than a rigger. So I'm going to come back into my puddle, and now I'm going to start increasing the saturation. Again, as we did when everything was wet. I'm coming in now with more saturated color, and I'm going to keep adding to that and just coming through my wet areas and seeing what happens. I've added some French ultramarine to my puddle of green, and it's going to give it much more value. And I'm going to switch to another brush. I'm going into my red puddle. I'm going to change that a bit into something orange. I think we're almost at the point, especially with that hillside, it's starting to dry. Some of this is so wet, it's not going to bleed into it because it's about equal weight of water and pigment. But some of it is going to bleed to a dry area where it's going to stop. So I'm starting to get some really interesting edges up here because this part of the hillside is dry now. Going to come down here and do a little bit more of that. And because we always want to have shared color throughout, I'm going to come into the foreground. I'm not sure I like this one hard edge. So how do I get rid of that? I introduce water to the pigment. This is a rule. Memorize it. So I'm starting away from the edge of that red part there, painting water up to it and letting it run into the water. So I have a hard edge on one side of that and a lost edge on the bottom where I introduced that fresh water. Okay, we can keep working this. I'm going to switch from my big brush to my rigger now because I do want lots of control over what happens next. So I just added more French ultramarine, blotted my brush. I've got lots of saturation in this brush. And now I'm just starting to add little places. Some are behind, some are in front. Haven't decided what about these white areas yet, because I don't have to. I can always come back into that. Again, I'm standing back here 10 feet away, and I can see this terrain start to become some real place. And as I increase the saturation of my puddle, I make different things happen. This is very wet right now. I don't want to go back into it. I'm going to add some water to this puddle so it's less saturated because it's further away. And let's just paint behind this area here with a bit of green. All right, I've got a hard edge that I like here and a hard edge on the other side that I don't like. So let's come back with our bigger brush and starting back here away from that, I'm adding just plain water and I'm touching the top of that edge that I don't want there. And I've just lost that edge. I don't know if you can see this very well, but I'll hold it up in a minute. I'm doing the same thing right here, giving it a hard edge behind this group. And now I'm going to lose that other edge. I always try to remember to rinse my brush before I come in to lose an edge. So I start pretty far away from that edge so that the pigment that I'm trying to lose the edge on has plenty of space to spread out. Just turn into a nice soft edge and turn into the far away terrain that we can't see detail in. Let's do a little more of that. Let's paint back here a little bit and let's give new things some substance back there. Rinsing my brush again, blotting it, starting way away from where I put that streak. And now I've got a nice damp area that I can do some interesting things in with that more saturated green to change the shape so it's not just like a halo. I might come back into this later on to do something else with it, but right now I'm going to add some orange to it. I can play with this for quite a long time. As long as I've got that standing water, I can drop color into it and I can change the shape of the colored area as well. Always remembering that I can come back and make sure I've got plenty of water into which it can bleed so that that lost edge up there is going to not hard edge again on me. And I think that's all we can do there. Let's come into this area in front and see if we can get a little stuff happening. Now, sometimes you do want two hard edges. You have to think both sides. So let's paint around this area right here. Oops, didn't want to do that. If you make a mistake and let your brush drop on your paper, do something about it right away. So some of this, well, I guess I'll lose that whole edge. And I don't like that being so wet, so I'm going to wick some of it up with a thirsty brush. I think you can see how the plants that I'm painting behind right now are taking shape. So my negative painting is accomplishing a couple of things. I can come back into these that are kind of amorphous right now later on and play with them. And one of the things I like to do is drop some of the colors I've got going on right into those puddles to give them different glows. See what happens when I'm putting yellow in here. It quite changes what's going on. I don't know if you can see how the planes are starting to separate and become new areas, new things happening, but this is how we develop on dry paper. And it's way easier than working on the wet paper. You don't have to be quite so careful with the amount of water in your brush, although you always blot. You always use clear water to lose an edge, and you always introduce new water to the pigment that you've laid down to let the pigment flow into the new water.
So Kelly, this is Sue. The top of the paper, that was dry when you started, correct?
Right, I did that last night.
And then you wet this area in the middle?
I just used my puddles of paint
Yes.
because I wanted to apply on dry paper. So you can see the very top of the hills that are in the background, that's a hard edge. And that hard edge is because it's dry paper.
Yes, okay, so we need a goodly amount of water in our initial puddle then, diluted.
Yes. Yeah, and think about the saturation that's in your puddle as well.
Okay.
If we just made a blue sky and didn't put any other color in it, what do we do now?
You can always come back to that sky later and add more things happening. One of the wonderful things that happens, if I take my nice big brush again and I wet it, right now I'm on the 1.5" brush. If I wet it gently, so I'm not lifting anything, I can come into that sky. Let's say I want to come in with some of this orange. I better come in with a big brush. So I've got a wet sky up on the tip of my brush. Wasn't as wet as I thought it was. Hold on. I can always come next to that with clean water. Now I'm putting much more interest in that sky, and this is after the fact. And this is going to keep spreading out, so it's going to be, it's already a pretty dilute puddle, but now I can use gravity also to change where that puddle is, because the only thing that's moving right now is the orange. The blue isn't going to go anyplace. And I have some interesting stuff happening up here that you'll be able to see when I take a picture of this later. And I can keep making sure that this isn't going to hard edge down here where I don't want it. Every time I do this, I end up with something that is spontaneous, and to me, the essence of watercolor, something that I can only get in watercolor. And that's very pleasing to me.
Sally, on the upper left hill, was that intended to be negative painting in front of which you're going to paint something else?
This?
Yes, because in the lower part, you said that was negative painting that was creating shapes. So I wondered if that were true for the upper part as well. Well, on the middle part, in the middle of the lower section where it's dark, you said
This?
down below, right there, you said you were it was negative painting creating shapes.
Okay, and I did that. Up here, I created this lighter area as shapes. And I'll do something about that as I go forward on this painting, and we'll come back to it. But right now, what more concerns me is this area over here, to which I've done nothing yet. So I'm giving some definition to these hills that they didn't have before. They were really far in the distance, and I'm going to do something about that.
So when you were creating the shapes mid-ground with the green,
Right.
And you were going into the, what I think is blue, kind of blue water there. I guess you then, as you go forward, you have to use some type of green or something to bleed into that water so that it doesn't just look like you have an edge of green there. Correct?
Yes. And I'm going to go back into my blue puddle here, and I'm not liking this right here. I think I want to make that into something else, but I didn't like it so bright. I like that better. I don't know that I like it permanently, but I like it better. I've got a bunch of standing water here. I'm going to wick up with my brush, my thirsty brush. Come back in with a little more value over here because I can, and I forgot to blot, so I'm going to have to do something about that. But I didn't like this big blank area over here, so I'm just tinting it at the moment, and I'll come back to it maybe. I also don't like a lack of division over here, so I'm going to do something about that. And look at how cool that is. I just gave myself 2 mountain masses. So I'm leaving that hard edge there and losing the edge on the other side of it. And now I've got a wet area that can use some more value. And I'm going to come into that with mostly blue because it's going to give me a little drama there. That has corrected the things that I didn't like. And I still would work this more and more, but let's just take a moment and cause something to happen right here. So now I've just added another little layer of terrain. I put me behind some little bushes here. I still haven't decided what I want to do about making some of this water or not. It's not bothering me yet, so I'm not going to do anything with it until it bothers me. And I'm going to wick up this little puddle I've got here that I don't like. So now I've separated this mountain from this mountain. I've gotten rid of an area that was just not functioning at all. I can still come back into this with pretty strong pigment and make something happen back here that is not terribly distinct. So I think I can let this piece rest.
I had 2 questions. One is somehow my hills got really, really dark in value. Do I need to wait and let them dry? And then how do I take down the value?
Probably you will have to wait in order to take down the value because we're not using things that are very staining here. We're going to be able to re-wet gently and dab with one of your number 14s or 12s, you know, your rounds, and try and loosen some of that paint and use a paper towel to blot it off. Or if that doesn't do it for you, I always keep in my bag of tricks a bristle brush, clean bristle brush that looks like this. This is a number 2 flat. I also have a number. No, that's a newer number 2. Hold on. And here I have a number 4. So these are clean bristle brushes, never been used with anything but watercolor. I use them because they're a little bit more abrasive than your fine-haired watercolor brushes. And so it allows you to use them as a scrubber to loosen a bit of paint. Does that make sense?
Yep, yep. And then the other question I have is I don't know where to go with the details. I mean, I'm wondering what you have in mind You know, are you seeing bushes back there, trees back there? What are you saying to yourself?
It
when-
depends on how far away it is. If it's a pretty far away, I just look at color masses. As I get closer, I get more detailed. I'm probably not going to do much with trees on either one of these pieces. I'll do more color masses that start to take, shape of maybe groups of trees or single trees maybe, but not at this
But
point.
you are thinking groups of trees, that we are seeing the outlines of trees.
Trees or bushes, it depends on how far away they are.
Okay.
I have a question about those trees that you just worked on.
Uh-huh.
How much water did you actually add? Like, did you have puddles again before you were working in that area?
On this little piece,
Yeah, the last piece that you were just working on, the last little in the valleys. when you
okay. Let's see. Okay, let's talk about where I created the two separate mountains.
were- Mhm, mhm.
I did that on dry paper, made a line that had a fair amount of saturation. That means a good bit of pigment to it. And didn't touch the edge that defined the front mountain, and then came in with my 1.5 inch brush that was not sopping wet, but wet enough to be able to distribute next to that edge and give it water, and in that water an opportunity to lose the edge.
Okay,
But always, just like last week when we were working on wet paper, when you're going to go and lose an edge, you've got to control the water in your brush so that it's not sopping wet. Otherwise, you'll not get a controlled lost edge. You always want to have control over it.